If you clicked on this video, then you probably are someone that has been struggling a bit to remember what your weapon skills do in Guild Wars 2. With 9 classes in the game that each have a plethora of weapons to choose from, it can be a little confusing to commit to memory which weapon skills do what things on whatever class you're playing, especially when you're trying to dabble in playing multiple classes. But don't worry, by the time this video is over, you should have an easier understanding of the weapon skill system in Guild Wars 2, as well as an idea of the patterns ArenaNet tries to stick to when creating these skills. With End of Dragons launching next year, we will be getting more weapon skills to toy around with thanks to the new elite specializations that will be releasing with it, and they will most likely follow the same general rule set of those that came prior. Of course, there are exceptions to many of the trends for one reason or another, but for the most part, they're pretty consistent. If at any point you find this video useful, or enjoy its content, leave a like down below and remember to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when the next one comes out. Now, without any further ado, it's time to answer the question of, how do I master my weapons in Guild Wars 2? To start off with, one of the best ways to learn what your weapon skills do is to read and practice them. This is extremely obvious, of course, but personally really helped me out whenever I needed to learn what a class did, especially when it comes to PvP. Something I really recommend doing is popping into the PvP lobby and heading over to the Combat Training Waypoint to test out what your abilities do on golems there. What this does is it allows you to enter a low threat environment where you can test the ways your weapon skills interact with the world and with each other. If a skill says it cripples or chills an enemy, test it out on the golem that's walking in circles. If it's a skill that knocks down an enemy, test it out on the stationary golem so you can see what it does to them. You start to recognize what each button does, and if you play multiple classes, will allow you to see the similarities between them across each class's version of the weapons they can equip. A very important thing to remember, however, is that because exceptions do exist, you may have to spend a little bit more time remembering the skills that deviate from the patterns, but it doesn't take all that long to reach a point where you will remember what a skill does, even if it is different from what you are used to. This is especially the case when you get into the realm of traits that somewhat change how skills work. Now, backing up to the intro of the video where I mentioned that the weapon skills in the game follow a set of general rules for functionality, I would like to touch upon those rules now. First, we'll start with auto attacks, which is by default the 1 key. These are the easiest to remember due to the fact that they have no cooldown and because the game automatically loops them after you press the button once. Depending on the weapon you are using, these attacks generally happen one of 4 ways. You execute a melee 3-hit chain, except in the case of Soul Beast where you get 4, a ranged 3-hit chain, a ranged channel, or a single range projectile attack. Across weapon types, this is mostly consistent. For example, so far, pistol auto attacks are single projectiles, as is also the case with rifles and both types of bows. Scepters are usually either 3-hit range chains or channeled attacks, the exception being Guardian scepter auto attacks, and martial weapons like axes, swords, and daggers are usually melee chain attacks. When it comes to these abilities, it is important to always complete a chain or a channel if you can, in order to get the maximum damage out of them. This is because channeled attacks are doing damage the entirety of the channel, so if you cancel them early, you're going to get less damage out of it. Let's talk about the second skill slot now. This is where you will usually find mobility skills and burst skills, and a bit less often, skills that apply minor control and utility effects such as the case of Engineer's Rifle 2 and Necromancer's Staff 2. Mobility skills are usually either of the leap or teleport variety, and burst skills are either channeled attacks, quick firing single presses, or AoE fields. The trend for the third weapon slot is sort of similar to the second in where you will see mobility, burst, and minor control effects. But this slot also becomes our first dive into hard crowd control skills, things such as dazes, knockbacks, and stuns. These types of skills are very important when it comes to your own survivability in the game. After all, if an enemy can't act, then they can't attack. They're also important when it comes to fighting enemies that have a break bar. If you don't know what that is, if you're ever fighting an enemy that has an extra bar underneath their health, that's a break bar. Sometimes it's gray and filled with notches. That means the enemy has a mechanic to it that will change the bar to a blue color. And when it looks like that, it means that you can use your hard control skills to chunk it down and your soft crowd control skills like chill, mobilize, and cripple to drain it over time. Usually this happens when an enemy has an attack that must be interrupted, and if you do, the boss or enemy will become stunned for a duration, and might even take extra damage from attacks for a little bit. That is why it is very important for you to learn which of your weapon skills have crowd control effects on them, because they are crucial for succeeding in some boss fights. So if you do in fact go to the PvP golems to test out your abilities, pay particular attention to which ones crowd control your enemies. Next, we'll talk about the fourth weapon slot. This slot and the fifth slot both contain abilities that have the longest cooldown to the 5 weapon slots. The fourth slot in particular usually has crowd control skills, most of them being single target, as well as aura abilities, boon support abilities, and point blank AoE abilities, and smaller line-based AoE fields. You also find some offensive abilities here as well, such as in the case of Rager and Guardian Torch and Guardian Focus. There isn't really much to say about this slot aside from those, so we'll move on to the next one. Finally, let's talk about the fifth weapon slot. Skills in in this slot will almost always have the longest cooldown out of all the skills that come from the weapons you equip. Because of this, they're usually extremely impactful, whether that be through damage, AoE potential, defense, or crowd control. When fighting other players in PvP, attacks in these slots are usually ones that end up having a really big impact on how interactions with other players may go. These abilities usually have some kind of big, obvious tell or windup, which lets you know that they either need to be avoided with a dodge roll or interrupted by a crowd control effect. And if you recognize that it has been used, then you know that particular ability will be down for at least a little while. It's the same vice versa. If you're the one using the ability, then you should expect your enemies to be thinking the same thing. The exception to all of this is Thief, since Thief does not have any weapon cooldowns, but it does have a resource system that fuels its weapon skills, and Thief's 5th weapon skill will always be the one that uses up the most energy on its weapon set. So if you see a Thief spamming Infiltrator's arrow on short bow, know that it probably doesn't have much left to attack you with aside from auto attacks. That's pretty much all I have to say when it comes to learning your weapon skills in Guild Wars 2. Just remember to keep on practicing with them and try to commit them to memory, but don't try to rush it if it's not quite clicking yet. People retain information at different rates, so I know personally that it can be a little bit overwhelming receiving a lot of information at once. So just take your time. Eventually things will start to make sense. The combat and build system in Guild Wars 2 can be a little complicated compared to other MMOs, but the freedom and interactability that comes with it is what cements the game as one of my favorites of all time. With that said, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.